to think, you know, there's nothing we can do about these things. The rich are always getting richer, right? But you know, that's not true. You know, the fascinating thing is that Canada was making great progress towards becoming a more equal country. If you go back to the 1940 to 1980 period, for instance, you find it was really quite a different country. That period, 1940 to 1980, early post-war period, is often referred to as the golden age of capitalism. And the reason for that is there was really strong economic growth, but that economic growth was widely shared among the general public. In fact, it's a concept that's sometimes referred to as the social contract. That is that, you know, there'll be capitalism, but the worst excesses of capitalism, unbridled capitalism, will be reined in by government. So, for instance, in that period, there was legislation that required the rich to pay higher taxes to help pay for important public programs. There was legislation enabling and protecting unions so that unions could go out and win higher wages and benefits and job security for their members. And in doing so, they not only benefited their members, they benefited other workers too, because they set the standard throughout the economy. And that had the effect of pushing up wages and benefit throughout the economy. And that actually is the real story behind the creation of the middle class in Canada. And in fact, if you go back to that period, it's really quite amazing. Do you realize back then, average incomes were roughly doubling every 25 years? And by the way, if it sounds like I'm kind of imagining this, let me just ask, anyone here born before 1980? One or two of you? Well, you lived in the golden age of capitalism. You lived at a time of far greater equality. And I don't know if you remember, you know, one of the questions that we used to pose back then was, given how things are going, what in the future will we all do with our leisure time? By the way, that was a reasonable question back then. Because at the rate things were going, we were going to generate so much more economic growth, and it was being widely shared. So it was absolutely reasonable to assume that we could take that economic dividend in more leisure time. Now, of course, we know that didn't happen, because instead, starting in the 1980s, essentially the rich became concerned about this rise in equality and this sense of entitlement among ordinary people. And they moved to push back against it, and they introduced a very specific set of policies, sometimes referred to as Thatcherism, Reaganism, the more recent version we have here in Canada, Harperism. And basically what it is, I think we all know the agenda: tax cuts for the rich, deep social spending cuts, privatization, deregulation, and a tax on labor. Sometimes referred to as the austerity agenda too. And at the time, I can remember when this was introduced, and at the time lots of people said, well, look at those policies, all that's going to do is support the rich, it's just going to be good for them. But people said, oh, no, the economists said, no, you'll see, the benefits will trickle down. Well, okay, the truth is it's now been 30 years, and we now have the statistics, and we can now say unequivocally that the benefits did not trickle down. They gushed up. In fact, the simple truth is, and the data is unquestionable, it's absolutely solid, based on Statistics Canada numbers, that all the income gains in the past 30 years went to the top 10%, but most particularly to the top 1%. Fully 60% of the economic gains, the increased income gains of the past 30 years, 60% went to the top 1%. And the top 1% more than doubled their share of national income. We went from having 3 billionaires to 69 billionaires today. Now, meanwhile, among ordinary people, there was stagnation or actual erosion of wages. So, for instance, the median family income in Canada today, once you factor out inflation, is actually slightly lower than it was 30 years ago. And to the extent that the middle class has kept up, it's only because they're working much harder. You know, back in the early post-war years, the one-earner family was kind of the norm, and that was enough to be middle class. Today, you pretty well have to have 2 incomes to be middle class. Not to mention having to work much harder. Oh, and that business about leisure time, gone, right? As a matter of fact, what happened is last year, the Harper government just took away 2 years of your leisure time. They did that by raising the retirement age from 65 to 67. And I just want to pause on that for a second because I was struck by the fact that there was virtually no protest about that. I don't know if you remember, but a lot of the commentators that have said, oh, well, this is completely reasonable. Canadians are living longer, so this makes sense. But that completely misses the point. The point is, if we had retained the more egalitarian system that we had in the early post-war years, the benefits of the economic growth in the last 30 years would have been much more widely shared. And we could have taken those benefits as a dividend. We could have taken that and actually not had a higher retirement age, but actually had a lower retirement age. That's what's been taken away from us. So instead, for instance, 30 years ago, the average CEO in Canada had an income that was roughly 25 times the income of the average worker. And let's just note there, an income 25 times larger than your income, that's a significant difference. So when I talk about the more egalitarian early post-war period, we're not talking about perfect equality by any means. But that's nothing compared to what we have today. Today, the average CEO in Canada has an income that's not 25 times the average worker. It's more in the range of 250 times the average worker. And in some sectors, like the financial sector, it's even more extreme. That character I mentioned, that John Paulson, the hedge fund manager who made $3.7 billion betting against the subprime mortgage market, that $3.7 billion meant that his income that year wasn't just 25 times the average worker or 250 times the average worker. It was 82,000 times the average worker. That means that his income that year was the same as the incomes of 82,000 nurses. Now, in what moral universe, I ask you, is that hedge fund manager worth the same as 82,000 nurses? I mean, in what moral universe is that guy worth the same as even a single nurse?